Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, bringing you a solo podcast episode today, talking about using historical data to find strategies in best ball, whether it's underdog best ball mania or just best ball in general, and why we have to be careful about using historical data, why I like to use it, even though there are some serious limitations to using historical data. I just launched an article over on Establish the Run titled How to Win Underdogs Best Ball Mania. Of course, the SEO gods got at that title a bit to make it sound a bit fancier than it is. But essentially, what I did is I looked at all the finalists in Best Ball Mania 4 from week 17 last year, applied our simulations. Shout out to the data science team, Sam Brott, Sam Walzak, Connor Evans for helping me with that. And from there, I could strip out, roster tendencies, constructions, stacking characteristics, different things like that, and see which were had higher expected average expected value among teams that used those versus teams that didn't in week 17. Also could look at the utilization of something like, let's say, teams that drafted 3 late round tight ends last year, their representation in the finals, the percentage of finalists that had that type of build was much higher than all the teams that used that build, meaning it was a pretty plus EV strategy. You were more likely to make it to the finals if you had that type of build. But as I point out in the article, it's mostly a descriptive exercise. And I think sometimes, as much as I like doing these articles, I do at times cringe with the takeaways I see people take from them and the applications that they use where they're just thinking like, oh, I have to do this. I have to go late round tight end because it worked last year and things of that nature. And that's really not what you want to be doing. I think the historical data is really important because you want to think through, what happened, what was the actual impact of that, and really understand how everything worked together in a previous season. And analyzing the historical data in a sharp way can help you do that. It can help you get on to plus EV strategies. But we also have to recognize that a season can only play out one way, and that's not necessarily the way it's going to play out the next way. We have new ADPs, we have new rookies, we have the field doing different things based on what happened last year. So you always have to be a little bit careful. I know one thing last year that I looked at, even though 2 quarterback teams in a vacuum, when I did the Best Ball Manifesto last year, I should say, prior to drafting in Best Ball Mania 4, 2 quarterback teams seemed better than 3 quarterback teams in a vacuum. But when I broke down the descriptive data, I found a few things that made me lean towards wanting to build more 3 quarterback teams than I had in the past. Some of that had to do with coming up with 3 different unique stacks in the Best Ball Mania tournament structure, but some of it also had to do with the fact that the elite quarterbacks were going earlier last season than they had in prior years, and that's going to change the math on whether 2 quarterbacks or 3 quarterbacks is better. So, yeah, you definitely just want to be careful using this information. And part of the reason why I use it so much, even though I'm saying to be careful, is like, quite frankly, I love doing this type of analysis. I like being able to break things down, making logical connections, chopping up the data in a way that I'm respectful of the sample sizes, but I'm still able to get at some information that maybe others aren't because they're not thinking to chop up the data or to use it in that way. So I'm always trying to do my best to kind of keep in mind not getting the sample size down too far, but still gleaning some really useful, interesting information. But even when I'm doing that, I'm understanding that I'm just telling you in a more interesting way what happened last year. It's the result of all the different individual player performances last year. It's not necessarily some sort of special key giving you, these answers that are going to work in perpetuity. Now and then there will be things that we uncover and time after time, and we see that repeat themselves. One would be investing early in wide receivers. I think we see that year over year, that if you, especially with the wide receiver ADP landscape, with wide receivers getting pushed up, if you're not drafting enough quality wide receivers early, you're in trouble in terms of your regular season advance rate. Once you get to the finals, a lot of these teams have already done that and it ceases to matter as much. But in terms of getting there, that's something that year over year is important. It's then now that doesn't mean like every year you have to draft 5 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds and that you can't only draft 3 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds. It just means in general, you don't want to be one of the bottom 20 to 40% teams in terms of your draft capital invested in the wide receiver position. So we do find those sometimes, those things that are sticky. And we also find things that are sticky that you definitely do not want to do. One would be drafting just one quarterback, for example, is something that I think the data is pretty clear on, whether it was my simulated finals, semifinals, quarterfinal stuff from last year or the regular season advance rate data from this year and last year for Best Ball Mania's 3 and 4. It just, isn't a very good strategy historically. Some may argue otherwise, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more. But my point being that mostly everything else in the middle is like up for debate as far as what you should do for the next year. I'm going to scroll to the tight end section of my article, and I think there's some good examples there that we can point about, like why this data is descriptive and not necessarily predictive, and like pinning down what it's saying. So what we saw last year in Best Ball Mania 4 in terms of the finalists, teams that only drafted 2 tight ends were in the finals around, in the low 40%, even though of all teams drafted in Best Ball Mania 4, it was closer to 50%. So they were underrepresented in the finals. Conversely, teams that drafted 3 tight ends were made up more than half of the finalists, even though they made up less than half of all teams drafted. So essentially, 3 tight end teams were positive leverage, 2 tight end teams were negative leverage. And that, of course, is correlated to the capital. If you invested more capital in tight ends, you were more likely to take 2. And teams that were in that first capital bucket, and when I say draft capital, basically I give each draft spot a draft capital score based on how successful it's been the last 2 seasons in terms of the points over replacement player at that position when it was drafted throughout the entire draft. So, and then I break it into basically just 5 buckets. Each is a top 20% team in terms of the most capital invested is bucket 1. A bottom 20% team in terms of least capital is a bucket 5 team. And you see that basically bucket 1 was terrible. That's your elite tight end group and probably mostly 2 tight end builds. 2 and 3 were pretty neutral. And 4, capital buckets 4 and 5 were great. Now, if we think about this, we don't want to say structurally late tight end, taking 3 late cheap tight ends is better than taking 2 tight ends and definitely better than taking an early tight end. That's not what we're getting at. That would be an incorrect takeaway. What we're saying is this is just another way of visualizing that Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and some of the other top tight ends had a bad year. And Sam Laporta and Trey McBride, who were late tight ends, had 2 of the best late round tight end seasons ever. That's what the data is telling us. So I still think it's interesting to look at when you get those performances, what is the end result and how it comes about. But essentially, we're saying a certain subset of players had outlier seasons on both ends of the spectrum, and that's completely shaping the data. We're not saying that you should not draft elite tight ends the following season. That's absolutely not the case. So just understanding that. And that's a big part of this, like how all of this flows together. Another example from my article is I looked at hyper fragile running back teams, teams that drafted, maybe even 4 or 5 running backs, but early running backs. This is a strategy that, when BBM first started was very popular, very good strategy to do, because the wide receiver ADPs were more inefficient, which let you make up for lack of quality early with quantity throughout, because you could get some rookie wide receivers very late that you shouldn't have been able to get. You could get starting slot wide receivers, in round 16. Now it's much more difficult to do that, which makes it difficult to spend early picks on multiple running backs and fall behind at the wide receiver position. Yet last year, a couple of interesting things. When the teams that did make it to the finals in terms of hyper fragile, only having rostered 4 running backs, were really high in expected value. Now that I think there's some signal too, where there's some some survivorship bias in terms of the teams with only four running backs that make it to the end probably drafted the right running backs. And if you look at those teams, they were either all CMC teams or they were teams that paired Brees Hall with Jahmyr Gibbs. They hit the nuts. And when you hit the nuts, you want to be using those scores each week and then being able to play best ball basically at the other positions. But the thing that I wanted to get at was in terms of making the finals, I think that's still a pretty risky build. Now, the data last year wouldn't show you that as a risky build. It would show you as a neutral in terms of making the finals and very plus EV once you make the finals. And you can see that in terms of 8% of all finals teams only drafted four running backs. That matches the 8% teams of the full field utilization. So I think if you're just looking at this, you're like, okay, here's a strategy that in terms of making the finals is neutral, but then it's super plus EV once I make the finals. I want to be doing a lot of that strategy. And the thing I would pull back on is, well, wait a second. Elite tight end did poorly. We just talked about that. But elite quarterback also did poorly, which means late round tight end and late round quarterback did well. So you had to draft another position early besides wide receiver, even if you're wide receiver heavy. So that sort of made drafting running back more acceptable, not because running back was great early, but just because of the way quarterback and tight end broke. So all this stuff is woven together. And it's really important to understand the connections and tease out, what you're actually saying here. So, um, and there's nuance with this stuff. Sometimes multiple things can be true. I saw a really good Twitter thread looking at first and second year players and the quantity of those on your teams and how many you wanted. And I think it came to the conclusion that 6 to 9 was optimal last year. That helped you a little bit in advance rate. And then end of season stuff, you were even better if you took 6 to 9 first to second year players. Now, as we've talked about a lot on Establish Run, you want a good mix of those players in that archetype in your builds. Even with the ADPs being somewhat aggressive sometimes on rookies, you want a good mix of those players for the reasons that played out last year. But we can also acknowledge two things at once. One, last year was like a bit of an outlier year in terms of getting Puka Nacua late round, having one of the best wide receiver seasons ever. We had Trey McBride, who was a rookie, when you looked at this data 2 years ago, would have hurt having first or second year players in a team. But now, as a second year player, has an absolute smash season, combined with Sam Laporta as a rookie, has a huge season. And that's inflating the data. It's not necessarily the rookies you would think of in terms of Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Quan Johnson, like those wide receivers we were super excited. It was more some of these other guys. You also have Brees Hall, who the market was just overly fearful of. He was a smash pick, whether he was the first, second, or had been a third year player, he was clearly a smash pick for his talent in the third and fourth round, with people being a little bit too terrified of the injury for Brees Hall. And in terms of quarterback season, CJ Stroud, one of the best rookie quarterback seasons of all time, maybe the best ever. You had that. And you also had low key Brock Purdy going really, really late as a year two player in the beginning of this stuff. So I think it's fair to say that it was a bit of an outlier year for first and second year players. I think it's also fair to say that to an extent, that's the point, is that if you're going to take players that have a chance to have outlier years, it's more likely to be younger players with uncertainty who can break out. It's not going to be 6-year players when we know who they are. Even if they're good players, we kind of know who they are and the range they're going to fit in, and they're probably not going to absolutely smash that so it's a combination of things. Do I think 6 to 9 will be optimal this year? Maybe. I've got teams with 10 players, on average last year at about 5 1 and 2 year players. So I think, but it is something interesting to think through in terms of the nuance of like, there's a reason this worked that is likely predictive and going to last in terms of the archetype of these younger players. But there's also a reason that it worked so heavily last year that might not persist year over year into this year. So, there's another tweet I saw was comparing range of outcomes weekly range of outcomes on Chris Olave versus Jalen Waddle. And a lot of this stuff you need to think through, like, does this make sense? I know I'll get into some of the week 17 stacking meta in a second, but I know Brick on Twitter replied to my tweet on the week 17 stacking meta. Sometimes you just have to logically think through whether something makes sense or not. And when I look at the Chris Olave versus Jalen Waddle, I think the tweet was trying to demonstrate, Jalen Waddle is the better best ball pick because his weekly outcomes are skewed a lot more to the right. He has more of these outlier high weekly outcomes. And I think to myself, does this make sense? A little bit. Jalen Waddle is a speedster. Miami is a somewhat volatile offense that's going to have some really big plays. So I do think that Jalen Waddle is going to be someone that has these really high end range of outcomes in his weekly upside. But I also look at Chris Olave, who is a prospect that we really liked heading into year 2 based on a combination of his prospect profile heading into the NFL draft, where he got drafted, and the success his rookie season. Didn't have the cleanest year 2, but if you look at his archetype too, like, he's a downfield threat. He's someone that can put up really huge numbers in a given week. And I'm not so sure that I'm writing him off relative to Jalen Waddle just because of the descriptive data of how their past weeks have turned out. And in fact, if you look at a player's standard deviation in terms of their weekly fantasy point outcomes, the year over year correlation, those is really small. It's non-zero, but I think it's in the single digits in terms of R squared, which means over 90% of the variance in a player's, standard deviation and their volatility week to week from year 1 to year 2 is explained by something other than what their volatility was in year 1. So that's something to keep in mind. The week 17 stacking meta is something I wanted to talk about as well, which I went in depth in this article. But basically, what I found is if you looked at of teams that made the playoffs in Best Ball Mania 4, just made the playoffs, not the regular season teams, the teams that made the playoffs, and you compared them to the teams that made the finals. Let's look at the subset of teams who all of their quarterbacks were team stacked, which means every quarterback on their roster, whether they drafted 2 or 3, was paired with at least one same team pass catcher. I want to look at this subset to remove the bias of these teams, maybe more likely being stacked or not. So that's not the case. So these teams, all of these teams have all of their quarterbacks team stacked. So that's important. Number one, if you look at that subset of teams, and then you look at the number of quarterbacks within that subset on each team that had an opponent bring back from week 17. So they were game stacking week 17. The teams that stacked week 17 more often of all the playoff teams were more likely to make the finals than those that didn't. And that makes no sense. We see teams that had all 3 of their quarterbacks game stacked made the finals at a 9% rate. Whereas if you look at all playoff teams that rostered 3 quarterbacks that were just team stacked, it was only 4%. Why does this make no sense? Well, week 17 hasn't happened yet. The whole point of that strategy is to be plus EV in week 17, which the strategy was, but it should have nothing to do with getting there. So why would teams that are week 17 stacked be more likely to make the finals than those that weren't, even though the team stacking for weeks 15 to 16 correlation was still there for both sides of that? I mean, the only conclusion I can come to is that people who were more prone to stack in week 17 were better drafters. They drafted better teams. And as a result, they were more likely to make the finals. And that's another reason why we have to be careful with this data, because what are we actually discerning from the data? Are we discerning week 17 stacking is good? I think we are for a different reason. But in terms of utilization rate in the finals, we have to think critically. And that should have zero or near zero impact on making the finals. Instead, I think what we're discerning is that, the cohort of drafters who were more aware of stacking in week 17 were better drafters than the rest of the field. And I'm sure this applies to other strategies and stuff we've broken down year over year. It's just harder to tease out that element of it. this was something that was very clear because we could kind of isolate the week 17 variable in a way where it shouldn't have mattered. But I think that applies to like I'm sure it applies to zero RB is one where I'm very big into zero RB. I think it's a plus EV strategy, but I also think that it's likely has its data skewed high a little bit, and that you probably don't get a lot of bad drafters and casuals drafting zero RB teams. You probably do get a lot of casuals and bad drafters drafting all sorts of running back teams, but I don't think very many zero RB teams. So all the sharp drafters are doing it. Of course, when you look at all the historical data, you're going to look and be like, oh, this is a plus EV strategy. Again, I think two things at once. I think it's a very plus EV strategy. I also think the data is probably inflated there. And the inverse, can be true as well. There can be strategies that um, people are doing that seem like they're very obviously bad, and maybe it's just because no one sharp has been willing to do these strategies. And I said I wanted to circle back to the one quarterback thing, but that could be one of them where I could be wrong, where maybe the one quarterback stuff looks so bad in the data because to date the only people who have been willing to try the one quarterback stuff have been drafters that aren't very good and aren't doing it very intelligently. I'm open to that possibility. If I had to guess, I don't think that's the case, but you could certainly make that argument. So it's important to understand these biases when we're looking at the historical data. The other thing I want to hit at is I think when people interpret this article that I just wrote or my best ball manifesto last year, they think they have to check every single box. Oh, I'm supposed to stack all my quarterbacks. Check. I want to week 17 stack them. Check. I want to be in this, bucket for wide receivers. Check. And what we see is that that's not necessarily realistic in every draft. Not every draft is going to break away that you can check every single quote unquote optimal box that the historical data tells you to do. Even if you assume that data, again, ignoring that we don't even know if some of that data is predictive or not. Even if you assumed it was, it's unrealistic. And we have to think through critically in our drafts. That's why I'm like really big on being flexible in drafts, and more on that in a little bit. But there's been, even when we trained last year for the Best Ball Manifesto, we trained a model to sort of predict the EV of all the teams. And the data last year in the aggregate that we were training on was very biased against taking running backs early. And it really wanted you to do heavy wide receiver stuff. Yet, some of the best EV teams, even with that bias in the training set, were early running back teams that didn't take a lot. And that's because they did it in an intelligent way that the model still picked up like, okay, you still got the requisite amount of wide receiver capital. You stacked these teams. If you're not drafting a lot of running backs, you took kind of the appropriate ones early. And we saw Pat Crane win Best Ball Mania 3, someone who generally doesn't take running backs early. I believe he went running back out of the gate with Saquon Barkley and Austin Eckler, only took 5 total. But he just built that team very intelligently, and he knew how everything was interconnected. He knew he was drafting earlier in the offseason, which means that the picks later in the draft are a bit shakier, which made him more willing to use quarterbacks on those selections, go 3 quarterback route. He had written an article on why 3 quarterbacks could be good for the Best Ball Mania playoffs, and how if you are willing to, you shouldn't draft running backs early very often, but if you're doing it, it makes a natural pairing with the 3 quarterback teams. And he gets there and he has a team that, structurally obviously can win the thing because it did win the thing. So it's really important to know how everything goes together and to be flexible. And even with stacking, like I didn't look at mini correlations and things like that. So there'll be times in draft where I can't get a week 17 bring back, in a way where I think is reasonable. Generally I'm looking at 3 things when I'm drafted. I'm looking at the value of the player, the position that I need, and the correlation. I'm hoping to check the box of 2 or 3 of those. Sometimes the correlation box isn't the one that gets checked, but you might be able to find a correlated piece with a non-QB piece that you have and get that many correlations. Now, it's not as strong when it's not tied to the quarterback, but it's something that we're not measuring that we know exists if we think through it critically. And yeah, I think you want to be willing to a little bit take the value where it goes. So I, for example, don't think double elite tight end is a very good strategy, good use of resources. But I had a draft already for Best Ball Mania 5 where I took George Kittle and Evan Ingram. Normally wouldn't do that, but I got both players nearly a full round after ADP. So the way I'm thinking through that is like the math is changing as I'm getting better prices on the two elite tight ends. I'm getting a combination that's probably not played together that well. And when I'm getting a unique combo, this is the way I like to do it. I don't like to reach and get a unique combo. I like to have it fall for me where people, even if they wanted to replicate it, couldn't really do it in the way that I'm doing it. And I'm having like one of the best versions of that team, of a double elite team, because the cost on it is so sharp. So just be careful if anyone tells you you have to do something. It's very rarely that you have to do something. If you are keeping in mind, again, those three things: positional need, ADP, correlation, and you're checking boxes, 2 out of 3 of those boxes, almost every pick, you're going to be in okay shape almost regardless of what your construction works out. And the other thing, too, with again, going back to how everything works together and the running back early stuff last year that ended up being okay. Again, you might have been right that running back early wasn't a great strategy, but because late round tight end, late round quarterback was so successful, that worked out. So you give yourself some outs in terms of like it's a downstream effect, across the board where if you're just getting value in what you're doing, there's ways it can work out. Now you don't want to talk yourself into doing stupid things, but again, I do think that flexibility is really, really key. And that's generally why I draft in terms of getting a lot of ADP value early and then figuring things out because I trust myself to be able to manage the capital in a smart way. And at the end of the draft, you've managed the capital sharply and you've got the correlation that you need. You're building a pretty plus EV team and it's going to be live to win in the playoffs. So I hope this was useful. I know I rambled for almost a half hour, but I just think it's really important to talk about the descriptive data, how to use it, why I use it, even though, again, I think like, in an ideal world, I'd have perfect simulations that I would run for the upcoming season, and I would be using those to give you data and not just historical data. But I don't have those perfect simulations yet. So in lieu of that, I'm really diving in to last year's data to find things others aren't finding and just to acknowledge even the things that are obvious to everybody why exactly they happened. Again, it doesn't mean you have to do them the next year. In many cases, you shouldn't do them the next year, and just be careful whenever someone says you have to, like if someone says you have to draft zero RB, even though it's a plus EV strategy, that's too ideological. Like you don't want to listen to that person. They're too invested in that strategy. Someone says you have to do elite tight end. That's not true. If you get the right value on the elite tight end, it can be a super powered structure. I think it's something that works really well in the Best Ball Mania tournament structure. And more than not, my teams will have an elite tight end on them. But if they all go too early, that's fine by me. I'll build a three tight end late team and be acceptable with it. I just want to make sure that our projections, our ranks reflect the elite tight ends appropriately. And if I think they do and I'm not getting them, that's okay. You don't have to do anything. What you have, I guess the thing you have to do is to just think critically through how you're building your roster and make sure it makes sense overall. And you want to look at that in terms of your exposures on players, zoom out, look at it in terms of your exposures of players, your exposures of your builds, and make sure it all makes sense. But in an individual draft, don't feel like there's 10 boxes that you need to check. And if you don't check every one of them, you're dead because that's not the correct way to approach it. All right. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Again, hope this was useful. If you are listening on the podcast feed, please like and subscribe. Same thing over on the Establish the Edge YouTube channel. Give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Really appreciate all the support, everybody.